Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. The Grand Hall of the Tellurian Royal Palace was a cathedral of suffocating silence and absolute aesthetic perfection. Floating crystalline chandeliers cast a cold, iridescent glow over the polished obsidian floor, reflecting the rigid, statuesque postures of exactly 2,000 alien dignitaries. For the Tellurians, diplomacy was not merely a political practice. It was a sacred, ancient religion woven with entirely inflexible rules. A single misstep in posture, a slight deviation in tone, or an unauthorized gaze could ignite an interstellar war. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the crushing weight of royal tradition that had remained completely unbroken for over 10,000 years. Every breath taken in this massive chamber was measured, every movement calculated to the exact millimeter. Into this delicate, fragile balance of cosmic power came a sudden, chaotic sound. The sharp, rapid clicking of small, frantic footsteps shattered the profound silence like a heavy, steel hammer smashing through a fragile pane of glass. Every luminous, multifaceted eye in the grand hall snapped instantly towards the source of the disturbance. Princess Valia, the sole heir to the mighty Tellurian Empire, was sprinting. She had completely abandoned all royal decorum, her silken ceremonial robes billowing wildly and haphazardly behind her as she darted across the flawless crystal floor. Her destination was not the grand throne of her mother, nor the elevated podiums of the High Council, but a lone figure standing incredibly awkwardly at the far end of the immense hall. That isolated figure was Harper Brooks, a biological hazard material specialist from Earth. She looked entirely out of place in this magnificent alien palace, resembling a bloated, synthetic marshmallow, far more than a respected interstellar diplomat, encased fully in a heavy, reinforced, bright yellow hazard suit. Harper stood completely frozen in place. Her thick visor was slightly fogged with her own frantic breaths, her heavy, lead-lined boots planted firmly on the pristine obsidian floor. She had been brought to this grand assembly strictly for a technical debriefing, explicitly instructed by 50 different protocol officers to stand perfectly still, speak only when spoken to, and absolutely never, under any circumstances, interact directly with the high nobility. Princess Valia clearly did not care about the rules of her ancestors. She collided with Harper with the astonishing force of a small meteor, wrapping her slender, pale blue arms tightly around the bulky yellow synthetic material of the Earthling's hazard suit. The young alien buried her face deeply against Harper's reinforced chest plate, clinging to the human as if Harper were the only solid, reliable object left in a rapidly collapsing universe. A collective gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror, echoed loudly through the grand hall. The entire assembly of alien nobility fell instantly into a state of profound, paralyzing shock. In traditional Tellurian culture, physical contact was considered the ultimate, unforgivable taboo. It was viewed as intimately vulgar, spiritually contaminating, and medically unacceptable, especially when concerning the pure royal bloodline. To willingly touch the princess was a heinous crime historically punishable by immediate and painful disintegration. To have the princess herself actively initiate such physical touch with a lower-tier species, hailing from a recognized Category 3 death world, was a nightmare scenario their highly advanced, rigid minds simply could not process. Several high-ranking scholars actually fainted on the spot, their naturally glowing skin dimming rapidly to a dull gray as they collapsed helplessly into the waiting arms of their panicked attendants. The Royal Guards, imposing figures clad entirely in gleaming silver biomechanical armor, did not freeze in shock. Their intense military training completely overrode their social horror. In terrifying, flawless unison, exactly 50 energy halberds ignited, humming violently with lethal, searing purple plasma. The guards raised their heavy weapons simultaneously, the glowing, deadly tips aimed directly at Harper's transparent helmet visor. Their directives were hardwired directly into their duty. Eliminate any potential source of physical or biological contamination to the royal air instantly and without hesitation. The perceived threat of Harper's earthborne microbes, even while safely contained within the advanced pressure suit, was treated as an active, catastrophic biological attack against the crown. Any normal, rational being facing 50 charged plasma weapons would have immediately dropped to their knees, raised their hands, and begged loudly for mercy. Harper Brooks, however, was clearly not a normal being. She was a deeply exhausted, severely underpaid hazardous materials contractor who had spent the past 72 hours straight dealing with incredibly aggressive, flesh-eating alien fungi on a doomed outpost. She did not raise her thick gloves in surrender. She did not let out a scream of terror. Instead, looking down slowly at the trembling alien royalty clinging desperately to her insulated waist, Harper simply let out a long, slow, muffled sigh that carried through her helmet communicators. Slowly, deliberately, and with zero sense of self-preservation, she raised one thick, clumsy, synthetic glove into the air. The royal guards tensed their muscles, their armored fingers tightening dangerously on their sensitive firing triggers, fully expecting an attack. But Harper merely brought her heavily padded hand down gently upon the crying princess's back. She patted the royal air softly and rhythmically, a deeply universal human gesture of awkward but genuine comfort. There, it is all right, kiddo, Harper said, her calm voice crackling loudly through the hazard suit's external audio speakers with a heavy, completely unbothered earth drawl. You are totally safe now. If the initial hug was an unimaginable breach of ancient protocol, the casual, rhythmic patting on the back was a blatant declaration of absolute diplomatic anarchy. The hoarse, dull, metallic sound of Harper's thick glove striking the delicate royal garments echoed through the silent hall like rhythmic cannon fire. The blind panic of the alien nobility multiplied tenfold in a matter of seconds. High ministers gasped and grasped their sensory appendages in sheer despair, unable to look away from the horrific display of affection. The heavily armed guards stood trembling in their polished boots, their advanced targeting systems utterly confused by the sheer, staggering absurdity of the unfolding situation. An ordinary human, mere seconds away from being vaporized into space dust, was currently treating the future, sovereign ruler of the entire galaxy like a slightly frightened toddler at a local neighborhood playground. The immense solemnity, the terrifying power, and the unbroken tradition of the mighty Tellurian Empire had been completely and effortlessly dismantled by a cheap yellow hazard suit and a few incredibly awkward pats on the back. The supreme ruler of the galaxy did not shout. She did not need to raise her voice even a fraction. The simple, deliberate scraping sound of Queen Zilera rising from her towering obsidian throne was more than enough to freeze the azure blood of every aristocratic entity in the room. The suffocating tension that had tightly gripped the immense hall suddenly deepened into an oppressive, crushing physical weight as she began to descend the floating crystalline steps. Each purposeful footfall echoed through the cavernous space like a heavy death knell. The heavily armored royal guards, who just moments before were ready to execute the human, immediately lowered their glowing plasma weapons and dropped rigidly to one knee, bowing their helmeted heads in absolute, unquestioning submission. The panicked, frantic murmurs of the high nobility vanished instantly, replaced by a terrifying, breathless vacuum that felt as though the oxygen had been violently sucked from the air. Queen Zalira towered magnificently over the assembly. Her majestic, bioluminescent skin pulsed slowly with an icy, dangerous indigo hue, projecting an invisible but undeniable aura of raw, unfiltered dominance. She glided across the flawless floor with the terrifying, predatory grace of an apex hunter until she stood mere inches from the ridiculous, brightly colored hazard suit. The sheer, overwhelming difference in their physical and social presence was staggering to behold. One was a literal god empress who commanded the fate of 1,000 star systems and trillions of lives. The other was a visibly exhausted sanitation worker who smelled faintly of recycled oxygen, industrial bleach, and stale sweat. "Explain yourself immediately," the queen commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it vibrated powerfully through the polished floorboards and rattled the teeth inside Harper's skull. By what conceivable right does a fragile, hopelessly primitive organism from a Class 3 death world dare to lay its unwashed, contaminated appendages upon the singular future of my eternal empire? Harper carefully and methodically unclasped the trembling royal heir from her insulated waist. She gently nudged the frightened girl toward a cluster of terrified, shaking attendants who quickly and silently ushered the young princess safely behind a reinforced decorative pillar. Harper then squared her heavy shoulders, fighting against the stiff, restrictive joints of her protective gear, and looked straight up into the glowing, multifaceted, furious eyes of the absolute monarch. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, I certainly did not ask for a royal audience today," Harper replied smoothly. Her voice remained a calm, steady anchor amidst the raging, silent storm of alien indignation. "I was heavily escorted here straight from the primary decontamination bays under armed guard. My only mandated objective was to deliver the final, classified incident report regarding the complete structural failure and biological breach at the Aegis outpost. I had absolutely zero intention of initiating any form of contact with the royal family. As you all just witnessed, she ran directly to me." Before the queen could fully process this incredibly blunt, entirely unembellished truth, a harsh, grating sound erupted from the elevated observation podiums. It was a chorus of laughter, though it was utterly devoid of any genuine humor. The grand scholars of the royal court had finally recovered from their dramatic fainting spells and were now leaning aggressively over their golden balustrades. Their wrinkled, gray faces were twisted in expressions of supreme, arrogant mockery. "A comprehensive report on the Aegis outpost," spat the chief scholar, his intricate, jewel-encrusted robes rustling violently as he pointed a long, bony, accusatory finger down at Harper. "Do not actively insult our superior intelligence, human." The Aegis orbital facility was completely and utterly overrun by the void spore. It is officially classified as a Class 9 parasitic extinction event. There is no incident report for you to give, because there are absolutely no survivors left alive to write one. That plague consumes all known biological matter and instantly converts it into pure, necrotic energy. It is an unstoppable, ravenous force of nature that has baffled and defeated our greatest scientific minds for over 10 centuries. The surrounding scholars nodded in fervent, synchronized agreement, muttering dark, condescending insults about human arrogance and their vastly inferior cognitive capacities. They scoffed openly at the mere, insulting idea that a lowly earthling could possess any relevant or useful data regarding a cosmic horror that had systematically devoured entire, heavily fortified planets without slowing down. Queen Zalira simply raised one elegant, glowing hand, and the mocking scholars instantly fell dead silent, terrified of her wrath. She turned her piercing, unblinking gaze back to Harper, her beautiful alien expression hardening into a terrifying mask of pure, cold, analytical certainty. "The high scholars speak the undeniable truth," the queen stated coldly, her absolute tone leaving no possible room for debate or negotiation. Our quantum probability engines have run exactly 10 million distinct simulations regarding a void spore outbreak. The infection fatality rate is precisely 100%. The survival probability for any infected host is exactly 0%. Once the parasitic spores successfully penetrate the host's central nervous system, irreversible cellular death is an absolute guarantee. My daughter was already in the final, terminal stage of crystalline metamorphosis. To stand before my throne and claim you have successfully saved her from an entirely incurable galactic plague is not merely a disrespectful lie. It is a mathematical, biological, and physical impossibility. The entire royal court collectively held its breath, fully expecting the small human to finally collapse in sheer terror under the crushing, undeniable weight of the Queen's flawless, indisputable logic. They waited eagerly for the pathetic, sobbing apologies, the desperate pleas for a swift execution, or the inevitable, cowardly confession of high treason. Instead, the heavily insulated shoulders of the bright yellow hazard suit simply rose and fell in a slow, casual, and profoundly unimpressed shrug. Well, your quantum math might be completely flawless, but your basic biology is severely lacking, Harper said. Her tone was as casual and conversational as if she were discussing the mild weather back on her home planet. I will certainly not deny that your terrifying void spore is incredibly aggressive. It spreads incredibly fast. It easily eats through solid, reinforced titanium bulkheads, and it multiplies at an exponential rate. But honestly, it is completely stupid. Completely and utterly stupid. In its mindless rush to consume absolutely everything in its immediate path, it entirely forgets the most basic, fundamental rule of being a living organism. Harper casually tapped the side of her helmet thoughtfully, the heavy synthetic material of her glove making a dull, hollow thud against the reinforced glass visor. It has absolutely zero basic survival instincts, Harper continued, staring directly and fearlessly at the baffled alien queen. It does not know how to store any excess energy. It does not know how to pace its own consumption. It just eats and rapidly expands until it burns itself out completely. All you have to do is introduce a slightly different organism that is even hungrier and way more stubborn, and your invincible, mathematically impossible space plague simply starves itself to death. The chief scholar, his pale face contorted in absolute fury at the human's sheer audacity, violently struck a complex sequence of glowing runes on his floating podium. Instantly, the center of the grand hall was engulfed in a massive, high-definition spatial hologram. The sudden projection bathed the majestic room in a sickly, pulsating crimson light, displaying the final, horrifying moments of the Aegis orbital outpost. The visual evidence was undeniably catastrophic and deeply disturbing. Thick, pulsing veins of dark parasitic matter were shown violently tearing through reinforced titanium walls, as if they were made of wet, fragile paper. The holographic display highlighted the station's massive fusion reactors, showing the relentless void spore completely absorbing the entire energy grid within exactly 4 minutes. Life support systems flickered and died in rapid succession. The terrifying parasite consumed every single joule of electrical power, every drop of thermal energy, and every trace of biological matter it could touch, converting an impregnable military fortress into a dead, cold, floating tomb in deep space. "Look at this irrefutable destruction!" the chief scholar bellowed, his high-pitched voice echoing loudly against the crystalline walls. The Tellurian Empire has spent exactly 3 trillion galactic credits and sacrificed 200 of our brightest scientific minds over the past 500 years, simply trying to understand this biological anomaly. This entity bypasses all known thermal defenses. It feeds on lethal radiation. It thrives in the absolute, freezing vacuum of deep space. You stand there in your primitive synthetic garments, and claim to have successfully starved an entity that literally eats raw plasma. I demand you cease this ridiculous foolishness immediately. Tell us the truth. Human. What highly classified, immensely powerful, experimental biological weapon did your primitive military governments unleash? Was it a synthetic dark matter virus? A genetically engineered nanite swarm designed to violently unravel molecular bonds? Speak! Give us the exact biochemical formula of the superweapon you deployed to neutralize this immortal parasite. Harper stared calmly at the horrific crimson projection of the ruined, dying station. She shifted her weight slightly inside her heavy hazard suit, her thick boots squeaking faintly against the polished obsidian floor. She did not look intimidated by the screaming alien scholar. In fact, she looked slightly bored and deeply exhausted. I did not use a weapon, Harper stated plainly, her voice cutting through the hysterical tension of the royal court with the heavy, blunt force of a solid lead pipe. I do not have high-level security clearance for a dark matter virus or a military-grade nanite swarm. I was a low-level sanitation contractor, trapped inside a lockdown cafeteria sector when the primary quarantine alarms went off. All I had to work with was emergency backup power, a secure steel biocontainment unit, and whatever leftover supplies were sitting in the deep freeze storage. So, I used a fungus from Earth. To be completely specific, I used a highly concentrated strain of rapid-rise baker's yeast. The profound silence that followed her statement was so incredibly deep, it felt physically painful. Thousands of brilliant, highly evolved alien minds crashed simultaneously. Their highly structured, incredibly rigid logic circuits completely failed to process the string of words that had just come out of the external audio speakers of the bright yellow hazard suit. To the Tellurians, the universe was a strict, unyielding, mathematically perfect hierarchy. Higher-order beings naturally dominated. Lower-order beings, apex predators, consumed weak prey. The void spore was the ultimate biological apex, a nightmare organism that sat unchallenged at the very top of the cosmic food chain. The concept of using a base, single-celled, completely lower-order microorganism to combat a highly evolved, invincible parasite was not just scientifically absurd. It was deeply, philosophically offensive to their entire civilized worldview. A baking ingredient, whispered one of the senior royal biologists, stepping cautiously out from behind a massive golden pillar. His wide, multifaceted eyes were blinking in rapid, uncontrollable succession, a clear physical sign of severe cognitive distress. You used a culinary microorganism, a primitive substance meant solely for preparing basic nutritional sustenance. How could a lower life form possibly defeat a supreme biological conqueror? The structural hierarchy of nature simply does not allow for such a paradox. Harper sighed loudly, raising a heavily padded glove to briefly massage the bridge of her nose through the thick, fogged visor. "Look, you guys are overthinking this entirely," Harper explained, gesturing awkwardly with one hand. "Earth is classified as a Category 3 death world for a very good reason. Everything on my planet is constantly fighting a brutal war just to exist. Our microorganisms have spent 1 billion years perfecting the absolute art of ruthless, unconditional survival. You look at the void spore and see a supreme, elegant biological conqueror. I look at it and see a really greedy, fast-growing weed. Yes, your alien spore is powerful. It absorbs complex energy perfectly, but it uses all of that energy to fuel constant, aggressive, highly complex genetic mutations. It burns incredibly hot and fast. Earth yeast, on the other hand, does not care about mutating into a superior form. It does not care about being a supreme galactic conqueror. It only cares about 2 basic things: eating sugar and multiplying. And it does those 2 things faster and more aggressively than almost anything else in the known universe." She pointed a thick finger directly toward the frozen red hologram of the ruined station. When I threw the infected biomass into the secure containment tank, I dumped exactly 40 pounds of dormant yeast right on top of it, cranked the thermal regulators up to exactly 95 degrees, and flooded the tank with every single ounce of synthesized glucose I could scrape out of the pantry. It became a brutal, microscopic turf war. The highly evolved alien parasite was trying to rewrite complex DNA and absorb energy grids. The primitive yeast was just blindly eating and dividing. Within exactly 2 hours, the yeast had completely saturated the closed environment. It violently stole all the biological nutrients, absorbed all the available moisture, and completely suffocated the alien spores. Your invincible, mathematically impossible nightmare plague did not die in a glorious, epic battle against an advanced superweapon. It simply starved to death in a dark metal tank because a bunch of incredibly stubborn earth fungus ate all of its food first. The assembly of royal biologists stared at the human, their jaws practically unhinged in a bizarre mixture of profound, existential horror and intense, undeniable scientific fascination. The terrifying, apocalyptic threat that had forced the mighty Tellurian Empire to abandon entire star systems. The deadly plague that had haunted their collective nightmares for generations had been utterly humiliated. It had not been defeated by superior alien intellect, advanced quantum physics, or overwhelming military firepower. It had been completely dismantled by the sheer, unbridled, gluttonous stubbornness of a microscopic earth fungus utilized by a cornered sanitation worker trying to save a child. The absolute absurdity of the situation laid bare the fundamental, terrifying difference between the two species. The aliens always sought elegant, complex, highly mathematical solutions to every cosmic problem. Humans, on the other hand, were perfectly willing to use a dirty, chaotic, and incredibly ruthless kitchen ingredient to win a desperate fight. The delicate figure of Princess Vyalia separated herself from the cluster of trembling attendants. She stepped out from the heavy shadow of the golden decorative pillar, her small, bare feet making absolutely no sound on the polished obsidian floor. She walked slowly toward the exact center of the vast room, positioning herself directly between the towering, majestic form of Queen Zalera and the bulky, bright yellow hazard suit of Harper Brooks. The young royal heir looked up at the elevated podiums of the high scholars and the massive assembly of terrified nobles. "I was completely consumed," Valia began, her voice a soft, melodic chime that somehow cut perfectly through the lingering, suffocating tension of the throne room. When the primary biocontainment seals failed in the lower residential sectors, I was trapped behind the heavy titanium blast doors. The dark, parasitic vines breached the main ventilation shafts within exactly 3 minutes. A single, microscopic floating spore landed directly on my left shoulder. By the time my personal royal escort managed to physically seal the outer corridor, I had already entered the fourth and final phase of crystalline metamorphosis. To heavily emphasize the absolute horror of her statement, Valia gently pulled back the thick silk fabric covering her left arm. The entire alien assembly recoiled in synchronized physical disgust. A jagged, terrifying, deep scar ran entirely from her shoulder down to her delicate wrist. The skin there was no longer smooth and beautifully bioluminescent. It was heavily textured, a dull, dead, pale gray where the alien parasite had aggressively attempted to convert her royal flesh into a raw, necrotic battery. "The physical pain was absolute and blinding," the princess continued, staring directly and coldly at the heavily armored commander of the royal guard. "My azure blood turned to freezing acid inside my veins. The dark, parasitic roots wrapped so tightly around my vocal cords that I could not even manage to scream for help. I remember lying helplessly on the cold, vibrating metal floor of the quarantine airlock. I looked up through the reinforced glass at my personal protectors. There were exactly 12 highly trained elite soldiers assigned solely to ensure my continued survival. But their environmental scanners flashed brilliant red. The automated biohazard alarms officially detected a terminal stage 4 infection. The young alien girl paused, taking a slow, shaky, deep breath that echoed loudly in the silent hall. "They looked right at me through the thick observation window," Valia said, her voice completely devoid of any childish anger, merely stating a cold, unfeeling, terrifying fact of their highly logical society. And then, strictly following the absolute safety protocols mandated by our ancient laws, they locked the heavy blast doors from the outside. They manually initiated the emergency thermal purge sequence. They purposely left me in the dark to be consumed alive, ensuring the pathogen would absolutely not spread to the primary escape shuttles. They mathematically calculated that my continued life was a statistically unacceptable risk to the overall survival of the Tellurian Empire. I was entirely abandoned, left completely alone on the floor, simply waiting for the parasite to reach my primary heart. The vast, cavernous hall remained completely silent. Not a single noble, scholar, or decorated military officer dared to speak a single word. What the royal escort had done was entirely correct according to strict Tellurian law. Pure logic dictated that a terminally infected unit must be immediately amputated to save the whole collective. Compassion and emotional sentimentality were heavily considered to be dangerous, primitive, and highly destructive flaws. Yet, hearing the small, fragile royal heir recount her horrific abandonment in such graphic detail sent an uncomfortable, entirely foreign shiver of profound shame through the gathered aristocrats. Even Queen Xylera visibly stiffened, her glowing skin dimming for a fraction of a second as the cold reality of their own perfect logic was laid bare. And then, Valia turned her large, luminous eyes warmly toward Harper. She came. The Earthling absolutely did not belong in the restricted royal sector. She was running blindly toward the civilian emergency escape pods, just like everyone else on the station. But she saw my body through the reinforced glass window. She saw the heavy, dark crystals physically tearing through my skin. Any rational, intelligent being would have kept running. Any logical creature in the galaxy would have immediately recognized a doomed, highly infectious corpse. Valia took a deliberate step closer to the human. But the human actually stopped, the princess whispered, the sheer, undeniable wonder in her voice echoing across the silent room. She took a heavy metal plasma wrench from her tool belt and brutally smashed the manual override controls. She intentionally broke the absolute quarantine seal. She willingly stepped directly into a heavily contaminated hazard zone without deploying a secondary energy shield. The dark crystals had added at least 40 pounds of dead weight to my fragile body. But she picked me up in her arms anyway. Her suit alarms were screaming loudly about critical exposure limits. Yet, she physically carried my infected, highly contagious body for exactly 2 miles through collapsing, burning corridors, violently fighting through heavy, falling debris and dense toxic smoke, just to throw me into a makeshift metal vat filled with raw sugar and primitive fungus. A profound, suffocating wave of shock washed heavily over the grand hall. The nobles exchanged wide-eyed, terrified glances. The scholars gripped their golden podiums until their delicate knuckles turned entirely white. To willingly expose oneself to a 100% fatal, biological pathogen was pure madness. To do so for a completely alien species, a total stranger who mathematically possessed absolutely zero chance of survival, defied every single foundational pillar of Tellurian logic. It was an act of raw, uncalculated, purely irrational self-sacrifice. It was an entirely terrifying alien concept to them. One of the senior diplomats, a tall, slender alien, heavily adorned in intricate silver chains, stepped cautiously forward, his voice trembling violently. "But why?" the diplomat pleaded, genuinely unable to comprehend the narrative unfolding before him. You are merely a sanitation worker. You had absolutely no sworn, binding oath to the crown. You possessed no biological or genetic imperative to protect her existence. The calculated risk of secondary contamination was absolute, by all known universal metrics. Your reckless action was entirely suicidal and completely devoid of any logical, measurable benefit. Why would you ever throw away your own vital existence for a mathematically doomed variable? Harper shifted her heavy weight awkwardly under the intense, collective, burning scrutiny of 2,000 baffled extraterrestrials. She slowly rubbed the back of her bulky helmet, looking around the grand, majestic room, as if these highly advanced, incredibly intelligent beings were actually the ones severely lacking basic common sense. Look, I am definitely not a quantum mathematician, and I am certainly not a brave royal guard, Harper replied casually, her clear voice echoing loudly through the external speakers of her suit. I am just a regular human being from Earth, and where I come from, leaving a terrified, crying kid to suffer and die alone in a dark metal hallway is simply not our standard operating procedure. You do not stop and run a complex probability calculation when someone is actively bleeding out on the floor right in front of you. You just grab them and you run. If there is even a tiny fraction of a percent of a chance to save a life, you take it, period. It is not about perfect logic or advanced math, it is just basic decency. The massive aristocratic crowd recoiled slightly, deeply flustered and intellectually overwhelmed by the blunt, unapologetic statement. The very foundation of their cold, hyper-calculated society was suddenly being challenged and dismantled by a tired creature wrapped tightly in bright yellow synthetic fabric. They desperately tried to process this terrifying, deeply illogical concept of pure altruism. The terrifying idea that raw empathy could somehow completely override basic survival instincts. That uncalculated, messy compassion could triumph exactly where advanced science and perfect logic had entirely failed, sent a ripple of profound, existential unease through the High Court. They realized, with a rapidly growing sense of both dread and immense awe, that this primitive, chaotic species possessed a strange, incredibly dangerous power that no quantum computer could ever possibly predict or quantify. They were staring directly at the absolute collapse of their cold, unfeeling worldview, brought down single-handedly by a stubborn human who simply refused to let a little girl die. The profound, deeply philosophical silence that had settled over the grand hall was suddenly and violently shattered by a booming, thunderous voice that practically shook the floating chandeliers. Lies. Absolutely fabricated. Treacherous lies. High General Kalar, the Supreme Commander of the Tellurian Astral Fleet, marched aggressively down the central crystal aisle. His massive, imposing frame was clad entirely in heavily plated, dark crimson battle armor that clanked menacingly with every heavy, deliberate step. He was a ruthless, decorated veteran of over 300 planetary campaigns, and his heavily scarred, angular alien face was currently twisted into a dark snarl of pure, unrestrained contempt. He pointed a heavily gauntleted, shaking finger directly at Harper's bright yellow hazard suit. Do not let this primitive, deceitful creature infect your highly advanced minds with her fabricated sentimentality, the general roared, his voice echoing fiercely off the crystalline walls, ensuring every single noble in the massive chamber heard his accusations perfectly. She is playing you all for absolute fools. The general stopped right before the towering obsidian throne, bowing stiffly and rapidly to Queen Xylira before turning his blazing, aggressive glare back onto the lone human. Think about the sheer mathematical impossibility of her ridiculous narrative, Kalar bellowed, spreading his massive armored arms wide. A lowly sanitation contractor, possessing zero advanced military training and utilizing a primitive culinary ingredient, somehow manages to single-handedly neutralize a Class 9 biological apocalypse. It is a blatant insult to our collective intelligence. There is only one logical, highly probable explanation for this entire catastrophic event. This human, acting as a highly trained covert saboteur for an unknown enemy faction, intentionally introduced the lethal pathogen onto the Aegis outpost herself. She personally orchestrated the entire devastating outbreak, mathematically calculated the exact moment to intervene, and staged this miraculous rescue mission simply to gain unprecedented political favor and secure a highly classified position within the royal family. A new, chaotic wave of panicked, high-pitched murmurs violently ripped through the massive assembly of aristocrats. Extreme paranoia was a deeply ingrained cultural trait among the high nobility, and the general's harsh, highly calculated accusations immediately gave them a familiar, logical, and deeply satisfying scapegoat to target, before Harper could even open her mouth to defend herself against the outrageous, entirely fabricated claim. General Kalar aggressively slammed his heavy armored fist against a glowing control panel mounted on his left wrist. Instantly, 6 heavily armed, spherical security drones detached themselves from the high vaulted ceiling. They descended rapidly, emitting a high-pitched, menacing mechanical hum as they surrounded Harper in a tight, inescapable tactical circle. The sleek machines immediately deployed shimmering, crackling energy tethers, aiming their lethal containment beams directly at the center of the human's chest plate. This creature is far too primitive to have spontaneously deactivated the void spore on her own, the general declared triumphantly, a cruel, highly victorious sneer spreading across his hardened, glowing features. She possessed highly classified, advanced biological agents provided by a hostile government. I am officially placing this alien under immediate maximum security arrest for the severe crimes of high treason, biological terrorism, and the premeditated, orchestrated endangerment of the crown. She will be taken to the deep subterranean interrogation cells, and we will aggressively extract the exact identity of her treacherous handlers. Harper did not flinch, nor did she raise her heavily padded hands in surrender. Encased entirely within her heavy synthetic suit, her eyes remained sharply focused, darting quickly between the floating mechanical spheres. As a professional hazardous materials specialist, her primary job was heavily reliant on reading complex environmental data, analyzing invisible radiation patterns, and identifying highly dangerous, unstable energy signatures. Her suit's internal heads-up display was currently projecting the exact energy output and frequency waveforms of the security drones hovering aggressively around her. She stared intently at the glowing blue data streams scrolling rapidly across the inside of her fogged visor. A sudden, incredibly sharp realization hit her like a heavy, physical blow to the stomach. The energy frequencies emitting from the general's personal security drones were absolutely not standard military issue. They possessed a highly specific, totally erratic synthetic pulse. It was a rhythmic, incredibly artificial waveform that she had spent the last 72 hours constantly staring at, while desperately trying to recalibrate the failing containment tanks on the dying space station. "Wait a second," Harper said loudly, her calm, sharp voice cutting directly through the general's aggressive posturing and the panicked whispers of the court. "You are saying I orchestrated this. You are explicitly accusing me of bringing the spore on board. Do not attempt to deny it, terrorist." Kalar spat back viciously, taking an intimidating step forward. Harper ignored his heavy insult completely. She took a heavy, deliberate step forward herself, pushing right up against the crackling blue energy tether of the nearest hovering drone. "When I was analyzing the remaining biomass residue to figure out its exact growth rate," Harper stated clearly, projecting her voice powerfully through the external speakers so the entire royal court could hear her perfectly. "My dosimeter picked up a highly unusual background radiation signature. The void spore is supposed to be a completely naturally occurring cosmic parasite, right? It feeds entirely blindly and indiscriminately on absolutely anything biological. But the specific strain that hit the Aegis outpost was entirely different. It possessed a synthetic, highly tailored genetic marker. It completely ignored 99% of the standard military personnel for the first 2 hours and aggressively bypassed the primary civilian sectors. It headed straight for the highly shielded Royal Quarantine Wing. That spore was genetically modified, heavily altered in a high-tech laboratory, specifically to hunt down and aggressively consume the unique biological signature of the royal bloodline. The chief scholar gasped loudly, nearly dropping his heavy golden tablet over the ornate balcony rail. A genetically modified spore? That strictly requires unrestricted access to the deepest, most heavily guarded bioengineering laboratories in the entire empire. Exactly, Harper confirmed smoothly, her eyes locked dead onto the heavily armored general. And whoever modified it had to use a highly specific containment field to safely transport the dormant spores onto the orbital station without instantly infecting themselves. A containment field that operates on a highly unique, deeply customized synthetic radiation frequency. A frequency that is incredibly hard to mask. Harper raised her thick, heavy synthetic glove and pointed a remarkably steady finger directly at the glowing blue security drones hovering around her. I spent 3 straight days staring at that exact same erratic frequency reading on my bioscanners while I was cleaning up the horrific mess, Harper declared, her voice ringing with absolute, undeniable certainty. And right now, my suit's internal diagnostic sensors are reading that exact same, highly specific synthetic frequency, radiating directly from your personal security drones. General, the energy signature matches perfectly, down to the exact 0.001% variance. Complete suffocating silence slammed heavily into the grand hall. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of the accusation hung in the cold air, incredibly thick and highly explosive. "You are lying!" General Kalar roared defensively, but his voice suddenly lacked its previous thunderous, absolute confidence. It was noticeably higher, slightly frantic, and heavily laced with sudden, raw panic. "This is a desperate, pathetic fabrication from a cornered animal. Guards, execute her immediately!" But the royal guards did not move a single muscle. Their highly advanced tactical helmets remained perfectly still, waiting exclusively for the supreme command of their true monarch. All 2,000 alien eyes violently shifted toward General Kalar. In the Tellurian species, intense, uncontrollable biological reactions were absolutely impossible to hide. When a Tellurian experienced sudden, overwhelming panic or extreme guilt, their internal bioluminescent network would aggressively and visibly malfunction, right in front of the entire staring nobility. The general's glowing, pale blue skin began to violently flash. It rapidly flickered between a sickly, chaotic yellow and a deep, terrified purple. His heavy battle armor could not conceal the bright, entirely erratic light show pulsating intensely from his thick neck, his scarred face, and his exposed hands. It was the ultimate, undeniable biological confession of extreme guilt and profound deception. He had intentionally used the mutated spore to quietly assassinate the young heir, clearing his own heavily calculated path to violently seize supreme military control of the entire empire. But his perfectly modified weapon had completely failed against a primitive earth fungus. Queen Xylira did not say a single word. She did not need to. Her majestic, terrifying posture shifted slightly, and her glowing, multifaceted eyes moved slowly, deliberately away from the exhausted human in the bright yellow suit. She turned her supreme, completely crushing gaze directly onto the sweating, flashing, rapidly hyperventilating general. The absolute freezing temperature in the massive room plummeted dramatically as the queen fully realized that the most dangerous, treacherous monster in the entire galaxy was not a mindless parasite from deep space, but the highly decorated, deeply trusted military commander standing right inside her own sacred throne room. General Kalar realized his grand deception was utterly destroyed. The flashing, erratic bioluminescence of his own skin was an undeniable confession broadcast to the entire royal court. Driven into a desperate, cornered panic, the hardened military veteran completely abandoned all pretense of diplomacy. With a terrifying, guttural roar that echoed through the vast crystalline chamber, Kalar slammed his heavy armored fist against his chest plate, activating his secure command frequency. "Initiate Protocol Zero!" the general screamed, his voice raw with violent ambition. "Seize the throne! Kill the queen and the human!" The grand hall erupted into absolute, pandemonious chaos. Roughly 300 elite soldiers, secretly loyal exclusively to Kalar, violently broke their rigid formations. They spun their heavy biomechanical armor around, ignoring the horrified screams of the fleeing nobility. The traitors raised their lethal energy halberds, aiming the searing purple plasma blades directly at Queen Xylira and the vulnerable Princess Valia. Simultaneously, Kalar activated his supreme bioenergy tactical shield. A massive, pulsating dome of blinding golden hardlight erupted from his armor, completely enveloping him and his vanguard, preparing to violently push forward and slaughter the royal family in a brutal, bloody coup. The loyalist guards rushed to defend their monarch, but they were caught entirely off guard by the sudden, massive betrayal. The distance was simply too great, and the general's golden bioenergy shield was mathematically impenetrable to standard plasma fire. The fate of the entire Telerian Empire hung precariously in the balance of a few terrifying seconds. Harper Brooks did not freeze. After surviving 3 grueling days on a dying space station surrounded by an apocalyptic alien plague, a heavily armored alien warlord throwing a violent temper tantrum barely registered on her adrenaline-spiked nervous system, she plunged her thick, synthetic glove deep into the secure specimen pouch strapped securely to her bright yellow hazard suit. Her fingers quickly wrapped around a small, reinforced glass test tube she had taken from the Aegis Outpost cafeteria to study later. It contained a highly concentrated, hyperactive slurry of the exact same rapid-rise baker's yeast she had used to defeat the void spore. With the smooth, practiced, incredibly ungraceful motion of a casual weekend baseball pitcher, Harper pulled her arm back and hurled the glass tube straight across the polished obsidian floor. The general saw the small object flying toward him and laughed a harsh, barking sound of pure, arrogant triumph. His impenetrable bioenergy shield was designed to effortlessly deflect heavy artillery shells and concentrated orbital laser strikes. A tiny glass vial thrown by a weak, primitive creature was a pathetic, insulting joke. The glass tube struck the shimmering golden surface of the energy barrier and shattered instantly. What happened next defied every single law of advanced alien physics. The concentrated yeast slurry did not bounce off. It did not vaporize. Instead, the primitive microscopic organisms found themselves suddenly bathed in an overwhelming abundance of pure, refined bioenergy. The shield generator was, essentially, producing exactly the kind of highly nutritious, raw, biological power that the Earth fungus thrived on. Within less than 2 seconds, the tiny splatter of gray sludge rapidly mutated, aggressively feasting on the golden barrier. The majestic, impenetrable energy dome flickered violently. The yeast multiplied at an exponential, terrifyingly fast rate, spreading across the golden surface like a massive, bubbling gray infection. It ravenously consumed the shield's power matrix, converting the lethal defensive barrier into a harmless, thick, foul-smelling foam. General Kalar's arrogant laugh choked off instantly as his primary energy generator whined in high-pitched agony and violently short-circuited. The massive power drain backfired straight into his combat armor, completely overloading the biomechanical servos. With a heavy, pathetic clunk, the general's armor locked up completely, trapping him inside his own heavy metal suit. His loyalist soldiers suffered the exact same technological failure. their advanced plasma weapons dying instantly as the rapidly multiplying yeast aggressively ate the ambient bioenergy from the immediate atmosphere. The entire treasonous faction was rendered entirely powerless, completely immobilized by a puddle of aggressive baking ingredients. The Queen's loyal guards immediately surged forward, without the protection of their energy shields. The traitors were swiftly and brutally tackled to the ground. Heavy restraints were clamped onto their wrists, and the violent rebellion was definitively crushed before a single drop of azure blood could even touch the flawless floor. A profound, stunned silence slowly returned to the Grand Hall. The horrific threat of a bloody civil war had been instantly erased, not by legendary martial prowess or superior tactical genius, but by a profoundly exhausted human throwing a tube of kitchen supplies. Queen Zelira slowly stepped down from her towering obsidian throne. The remaining nobles held their collective breath, falling to their knees in absolute reverence. The majestic monarch glided across the floor, completely ignoring the restrained, humiliated general. She stopped directly in front of Harper Brooks. The imposing ruler of 1,000 star systems looked deeply into the fogged, scratched visor of the bright yellow hazard suit. Then, performing an action that completely shattered 10,000 years of rigid imperial tradition, Queen Zelira deliberately and gracefully bowed her head to the human. The collective gasp from the high nobility was loud enough to vibrate the floating chandeliers. The supreme ruler of the galaxy had never bowed to any living creature, let alone a primitive being from a distant death world. It was a gesture of ultimate, unparalleled respect and boundless gratitude. "Harper Brooks of Earth," the Queen proclaimed, her voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. "You have single-handedly saved the sole heir to my empire, exposed a devastating, treacherous conspiracy, and defeated our greatest historical enemies with an elegance we could never possibly comprehend. Your species possesses a profound, beautiful, and highly dangerous practicality. Hear my decree. From this exact moment forward, the planet Earth is officially recognized as the supreme, eternal ally of the Telerian Empire. Your world shall be permanently protected under our heaviest planetary defense fleets. We shall learn from your chaotic resilience, and we shall never again underestimate the boundless power of human ingenuity." The political landscape of the entire galaxy had just shifted permanently. Earth, a tiny, overlooked planet, was instantly elevated to the highest possible cosmic status. The assembled scholars and diplomats stared at the human with absolute awe, terrified and completely fascinated by the incredible, logic-defying nature of her species. They fully expected the human hero to deliver a grand, sweeping, highly philosophical speech to perfectly match the monumental, historic occasion. Harper stared back at the bowing alien queen, surrounded by thousands of kneeling aristocrats and subdued traitors. She slowly reached up and wiped a streak of condensation off her thick visor. She let out a long, heavy, incredibly tired sigh that echoed loudly through the entire chamber. "Yeah, that sounds great, Your Majesty," Harper muttered, her voice cracking slightly with sheer exhaustion. "But right now, I just really want to go home. Take off this incredibly sweaty suit and drink a large, dangerously strong cup of hot coffee." Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Sci-fi Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen. Or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.